Readings of Almighty God's Words. The responsibilities of leaders and workers. The responsibilities of leaders and workers, 12. 2. Not caring or asking about expenditures of offerings. Another manifestation of false leaders with regard to safeguarding offerings is that they don't know how to manage offerings. They know only that the offerings aren't to be touched, that they're not to be misappropriated arbitrarily or embezzled, that they're sacred, set apart as holy, and that one can't have improper thoughts about them. But when it comes to how exactly to manage the offerings well, how to be a good steward in safeguarding them, they have no path, no principles, no specific plans or steps for this work. So, in matters such as registering, tallying, and safeguarding offerings, as well as checking accounts of incomings and outgoings, and checking expenditures, these false leaders are quite passive. When someone submits something for approval, they sign off on it. When someone applies for reimbursement, they give it to them. When someone applies for money for some purpose, they hand it out to them. They don't know where the various machines and equipment are being safeguarded. They also don't know whether their custodian is suitable, nor how to tell if they are. They can't see through to people's hearts, and they can't see through to people's essences. So, though there are records of all outgoing offerings under the scope of these people's management, looking at the details of the expenditures in those accounts, many of the expenditures are unreasonable and unnecessary. Many of them are excessive and wasteful. The offerings are lost under the signatures of these leaders and workers. By appearances, they seem to be doing specific work, but in fact, there are no principles at all to what they're doing. They're not carrying out vetting. They're going through the motions, adhering to rules and regulations, nothing more. This doesn't meet the standards for managing offerings at all, much less its principles. So, during the period when false leaders are at work, there are too many unreasonable expenditures. If there's someone there to supervise and manage things, how do these unreasonable expenditures come about? It's because these leaders and workers don't take responsibility in their work. They go through the motions and deal with things in a perfunctory manner, and they don't act according to the principles. They don't offend others. They act like people pleasers, and they don't carry out proper vetting. There even may not be one truly responsible person among those who manage offerings, not one who can truly carry out vetting. False leaders pay no heed to whether the people safeguarding offerings are suitable, or to whether there are any dangerous situations at those people's churches. To them, so long as they themselves are safe, then everything's fine. When danger arises, the first thing they think of is where they can run to and whether their own money will be raided, whereas they neither look into nor ask about the whereabouts of offerings or whether they're in danger. A few months or even half a year after the incident, they may ask out of conscience, and when they learn that some offerings have been taken into the great red dragon's possession, that some have been squandered by evil people, and that the whereabouts of some are unknown, they'll feel bad for a while. They'll pray a bit, admit to their mistake, and that'll be the end of it. What sort of creatures are these people? Isn't there a problem with working like this? How will God treat someone who harbors such an attitude toward offerings? Will He regard them as a true believer? What will He regard them as then?
As a non-believer.
When God regards someone as a non-believer, does that person get a feeling? They get numb and dull-witted in their spirit, and when they act, they don't have God's enlightenment or guidance or any light. They don't have God protecting them when things happen to them, and they're often negative and weak, living in darkness. Though they listen to sermons often and can suffer and pay a price in their work, they simply don't make any progress, and they cut a pathetic figure. Those are their results. Is this not even harder to bear than punishment? Tell me, if this is the result of someone's belief in God, is that a cause for joy and celebration, or for grief and lamentation? It's not a good sign, in my opinion. False leaders never take the work of managing offerings seriously. Although they say, people must not touch God's offerings. God's offerings shouldn't be embezzled by anyone, and they shouldn't fall into the hands of bad people. And they shout these slogans quite well, and their words sound very moral and decent, but they don't act like humans. Though they don't embezzle offerings, and they don't have improper thoughts about them, or any intent to seize them, and some of them never even use the money of God's house, or touch God's offerings for any expense they may have, and instead spend their own money. As leaders and workers, they do no real work at all when it comes to the management of offerings. They don't even do such simple things as asking about the state of the expenditure of offerings or vetting expenditures of offerings. These, clearly, are false leaders. Their attitude toward offerings is this: I don't spend them, and I don't embezzle them, and I also don't concern myself with how others spend them, or whether others embezzle them. I say to these false leaders that this lukewarm attitude of yours is very troublesome. Not spending them and not embezzling them is what people should do, but as a leader or worker, what you should do even more is manage offerings well, and yet you have failed to do this. That's called a dereliction of duty. This is a manifestation of a false leader. You may not have spent a cent or embezzled a single offering, but because you don't do actual work, and you don't do any specific management work concerning the offerings, you're characterized as a false leader, and doing so is justified and reasonable. Some leaders never take or use any offerings at all. Even if all the other leaders and workers use them, they don't. And when God's house arranges to give them something, they refuse it. They seem quite clean and free of covetousness. But when they are arranged to manage offerings, they won't do any specific work at all. No matter who is spending offerings, they'll sign off on it. They don't even make any inquiries, and they don't say a word more about it. Though these people do not embezzle 1 cent of the offerings, under the scope of their management, offerings are taken into the possession of evil people. And because of their irresponsibility and dereliction of duty, offerings may be squandered and wasted by anyone. Isn't this squandering and waste related to their mismanagement? Isn't it caused by their dereliction of duty? Do they not have a share in these people's evil deeds? Don't they bear responsibility for them? This is a great responsibility to bear, and they cannot shirk it. They just stick to their line. In any case, I'm not embezzling God's offerings, and I don't wish to or plan to. No matter who spends God's offerings, I don't spend them. No matter who takes and uses them, I don't. No matter who enjoys them, I don't. This is my attitude toward offerings. You can do whatever you want. Are there such people?
Yes.
Antichrists spend offerings on high-end clothes, luxury goods, and even cars. Tell me, can this sort of false leader perceive this problem? They do not embezzle the offerings themselves. They have this attitude. So don't they believe that it's bad to embezzle them? So when antichrists do such great evil, why do they ignore it and not put a stop to it? Why don't they take it seriously? Is that not an evil deed? This is not fulfilling the responsibility that a steward ought to. If, during your management, offerings are taken into the possession of evil people, if they're squandered, wasted, and spent in an unreasonable manner, if they slip away like this, and yet you don't do any work or even say a word, is that not a dereliction of duty? Is that not the manifestation of a false leader? If you don't say what you should, don't do the work you should, don't fulfill the responsibility you should, and though you understand every doctrine, you just don't do actual work, then you're definitely a false leader. You believe, in any case, I'm not embezzling the offerings. If others do, that's their business. Are you not a false leader then? Not embezzling the offerings is your personal business, but have you safeguarded the offerings well? Have you fulfilled your responsibility with regard to the offerings? If you haven't, you're a false leader. Don't find excuses for yourself, saying, "In any case, I don't embezzle the offerings, so I'm not a false leader." Not embezzling offerings doesn't qualify as a criterion for measuring whether a leader or worker is up to standard. The true criterion for whether they're up to standard is if they fulfill their responsibility, carry out what a person should do, and fulfill the obligation a person should fulfill in the things entrusted to them by God. That's what's most important. So, in the management of offerings, what is your obligation and responsibility? Have you carried out all of it? It's quite clear that you haven't. You're just going through the motions. You're afraid of offending people, but you're not afraid of offending God. You disregard the offerings because you're afraid of offending people, of damaging your good image in their eyes. If you have this manifestation, you're definitely a false leader. This isn't slapping a label on you. The facts are laid out for all to see. You can't even fulfill your obligation and responsibility. You're so selfish. You manage your own things, your personal property, quite well, conscientiously, and carefully. You don't let those things get exposed to the elements. You don't let anyone carry them off, and you don't let anyone take advantage of you. But with the offerings, you have no sense of responsibility at all. You don't even carry out 1/10 of the responsibility that you do when it comes to managing your own things. How can you be considered a good steward? How can you be considered a leader or worker? You're evidently a false leader. This is a manifestation of one kind of false leader. 3. Restricting reasonable expenditures. There's another sort of false leader, and they're also quite loathsome. After people like this become leaders, they see that the person who's been safeguarding the offerings has been spending money extravagantly and very wastefully, so they dismiss them. They then wish to find a person who is able to plan meticulously and budget carefully, who really pinches pennies, and who knows how to run a home economically. They think that's the sort of person who'd be a good steward, and it turns out that they don't think anyone's suitable, and they wind up safeguarding the offerings themselves. When the brothers and sisters say that some copies of books of God's words need to be printed for preaching the gospel, these leaders don't allow this to be done, thinking that it costs quite a lot to print books. They don't care if it's urgently needed for the work. For them, it's fine as long as they save money. They simply don't know where using God's offerings would be most in line with His intentions. All they know to do is to protect God's offerings and to not let them be touched at all. They don't spend what should be spent. They're carrying out vetting really well, all right. How can the work proceed like this? Do these leaders have principles to their actions? They don't allow work to be done that should be done, or allow books to be printed that should be printed, or allow money to be spent that has to be spent. They don't permit any reasonable expenditure. Is that management? What is it? It's a lack of understanding of the principles. People who lack understanding of the principles don't know how to manage the offerings when they work. They believe that they must keep watch over the money and not let it be diminished by a single cent, and that no matter what the expenditure, the money is not to be touched. Is this in line with God's intentions?
No, it isn't.
Regulating things and carrying out vetting without principles isn't management. Wanton spending, waste, and squandering isn't management. But not letting a cent be spent and restricting reasonable expenditures due to vetting isn't management either. Neither is in line with the principles. Because some people don't understand the principles for using, allocating, and managing offerings, all sorts of farces and all sorts of chaos come about. These leaders seem from the outside to be quite responsible and dedicated, but how's the work they're doing?
It's unprincipled.
And because it's unprincipled, the gospel work in their area meets with hindrance and restriction, and some professional work is restricted as well, due to their overly strict vetting of the usage of offerings. On the surface, they appear very conscientious and responsible in their safeguarding of the offerings. But in fact, because they don't have spiritual understanding and just act based on their notions and imaginings, and they even carry out vetting for God's house under the guise of being frugal for the church's sake, they severely impact the progress of the various items of the church's work without even knowing it. Can such people be characterized as false leaders? This qualifies them as false leaders. To a certain extent, they have already caused disturbances and disruptions to the gospel work and to the work of the church. These disturbances and disruptions are caused by their lack of understanding of the principles, as well as them working recklessly based on their own preferences and notions, and not seeking the truth principles, or discussing things, or cooperating with others. Offerings will not be wasted or squandered when they're with them, but they can't use offerings reasonably according to the principles, and don't allow them to be used just for the sake of protecting them, and consequently, the work of spreading the gospel is delayed, and the normal operation of the work of God's house is impacted. So, based on this manifestation, it's not excessive at all to characterize them as false leaders. Why are such people also characterized as false leaders? They don't know how to do work, and their comprehension of how to treat offerings and ways of treating them are so distorted. So, can they do other work well? Certainly not. Is there not a problem with these people's comprehension? Their comprehension is distorted. They adhere to regulations. They engage in pretense, and they're pseudo-spiritual. They don't consider the work of God's house, and they don't act according to the principles. They can't find the principles for acting, and they just go by their own petty cleverness and their own will and abide by regulations. That's why their work results in disturbances and disruptions. Their way of working is stupid and clumsy. It's disgusting. Such people are obviously false leaders. Is there anyone who says, "I safeguard the offering so well, I do this work so attentively, and still I'm characterized as a false leader. I won't manage them any more then"? Whoever wants to spend them can. Whoever wants to use them can. Whoever wants to take them can. Is there anyone who has that thought? What then is our purpose in exposing the different states and manifestations of the various sorts of false leaders?
To get people to grasp the principles and avoid walking the path of false leaders.
That's right. It's to get people to grasp the principles, to be able to do their work well and fulfill their responsibility in accordance with the principles, to not go off imaginings and notions, to not harbor human will or impetuousness, to not let a theory they've imagined stand in for the truth principles, to not pretend to be spiritual, and to not use what they believe to be spirituality as a counterfeit or replacement for the principles. Such people do exist among leaders and workers, and it's worth taking them as a warning. 4. Seizing and enjoying offerings. There's another sort of false leader, and the work they do when it comes to managing offerings is even more of a mess. They believe that as a leader or worker, they can't always have their eyes fixed on the offerings, or be so attentive when it comes to the offerings. They think they just need to do the church's administrative work well, and perform the work of church life and of the life entry of God's chosen people well, and in addition to that, ensure that the various kinds of professional work are done well. They believe that offerings are money and items that God provides to the church, and that this money and these items are there to meet the needs of leaders and workers in their lives and work. The implication here is that offerings are prepared for leaders and workers, and that once someone has been chosen as a leader or worker, God permits them to enjoy these offerings, and that leaders and workers get priority in allocating them, enjoying them, and spending them. And so, once a person becomes a leader or worker, they become the master of the offerings, the manager and owner of the offerings. When people of this sort come into contact with offerings in their work, they don't register them, tally them, or safeguard them, nor do they check the accounts of incoming and outgoing offerings. Much less do they inspect the status of their expenditure and allocation. Instead, they look into and get a grasp on what offerings there are and whether there are any that leaders and workers can enjoy. This is the sort of attitude these leaders and workers have toward offerings. In their view, offerings don't need to be registered, tallied, safeguarded, or to have their incomings and outgoings or the state of their expenditure inspected. Such things have nothing to do with them. They just need to allocate the offerings to leaders and workers, giving them priority when it comes to enjoying the offerings. In their view, what leaders and workers say is the principle. It's their decision how to spend and allocate the offerings. They believe that being chosen as a leader or worker means that someone has already been made perfect, and that, like a priest, they have the privilege to enjoy offerings, as well as the final say, right of usage, and right of allocation when it comes to the offerings. In some churches, before things that the brothers and sisters offer up can be registered, tallied, and put into storage by the proper personnel, leaders and workers have already looked, sifted, and filtered through them, keeping whatever they can use, eating whatever they can eat, putting on whatever they can wear, and allocating whatever they don't need directly to whoever has need of it, thereby calling the shots in place of God. This is their principle. What's going on here? Do they truly think they're priests? Isn't this extremely lacking in reason? There are other leaders and workers who see that one family is short of 2 chairs, that another is missing a stove, and that somebody's in poor health and needs to take health supplements, and then use the money of God's house to buy all these things. The allocation, consumption, expenditure, and right of usage of all offerings belong to these leaders and workers. Does this make sense? Is this approach not caused by something going wrong with their cognition? On what basis are they calling the shots? Do leaders and workers have the right to control the offerings?
No.
The offerings are for them to manage, not for them to control and use. They do not have the privilege to enjoy them. Are leaders and workers equivalent to priests? To people who have been made perfect? Are they the owners of the offerings?
No.
Then why do they decide to use offerings to buy things for this and that family without authorization? Why do they have that right? Who gave that right to them? Do the work arrangements stipulate the first thing leaders and workers should do after taking up their position is to assume total control over the finances of God's house? Why is there a portion of leaders and workers who believe this then? What's the problem there? When a brother or sister offers up an expensive garment and there's a leader or worker wearing it the next day, what is going on? Why do offerings made by brothers and sisters fall into an individual's hands? Individual here means no one other than the leader or worker. They don't just fail to manage the offerings well. Instead, they lead the way in seizing them and personally enjoying them. What's the problem here? If we look at this leader or worker in light of them not doing actual work when it comes to the management of offerings, they may then be characterized as a false leader. But if we look at them in terms of them seizing and personally enjoying offerings, they may 100% be characterized as an antichrist. So what exactly is the sensible way to characterize the person in question? They're both a false leader and an antichrist. In managing offerings, false leaders look through all the offerings, and they commission people to manage them. But before they do that, they seize a portion for themselves and decide without authorization to allocate another portion. As for the things that are left, which they don't want, or which they don't recognize but don't wish to give away, they put these things to the side for the time being. When it comes to the whereabouts of those offerings, whether there's a suitable person to safeguard them, whether they should be inspected regularly, whether anyone's stealing them, or whether anyone's seizing them, false leaders uniformly do not concern themselves with these things. Their principle is this: I've already gotten my hands on the things I should enjoy and the things I need. Whoever wants to take the leftover things that I don't need can take them. Whoever wants to manage them can manage them. They belong to whoever grabs them first. Whoever's hands they fall into takes advantage. What sort of principle and logic is this? Such people are simply devils and beasts. Once, a false leader said that there was quite a lot of stuff in the storeroom, and I asked whether they'd registered it. They said, "I don't even know what some of those things are, so there's no way to register them." I said, "That's nonsense. How could you have no way to register them? There should be records of them from when they were first brought here. It was quite a long time ago. There's no way of knowing. What sort of talk is this? Are they taking responsibility?" I said, "There are some clothes. See which of the brothers and sisters needs them, and issue the clothes to them. Some of them are out of style. No one's interested." I said, "Issue out what the brothers and sisters need, and handle what they don't need appropriately." They didn't follow through with this. Were they being conscientious and diligent? When they're asked to do a piece of work, they keep complaining, saying negative things, and pointing out difficulties. What they don't say is that they'll handle these things well, according to the principles. They have no intent at all to submit. No matter what requirement someone makes of them, they keep talking about difficulties, as though if they render that person speechless by going on like this, they'll win and gain the upper hand, and then be done with their work. What kind of creature is this person? You were not made a leader or worker so that you could cause trouble, or so that you could point out difficulties and issues. It was so that you could resolve problems and handle difficulties. If you are truly capable in your work, then after raising issues and difficulties, you'd go on to talk about how you would handle and resolve them according to the principles. False leaders can only shout slogans, preach doctrine, talk big, and speak about objective justifications and excuses. They have no real work capability at all, and with the management of offerings, they're likewise unable to act according to the principles or fulfill their responsibility. This is how feeble-minded and incapable they are. Yet they still feel that now that they're a leader or worker, they have privileges and status, possess a distinguished identity, and are the owner and user of offerings. This sort of false leader only knows how to enjoy the privilege of spending offerings. They can't see or discover any cases of unreasonable, indiscriminate expenditure of offerings, and they may even see them, yet do nothing to handle them. Why is this? It's because they only know to enjoy the sense of superiority that comes with being a leader or worker. They have no understanding at all of God's requirements of leaders and workers, or of the principles for doing the work of God's house. They're just good-for-nothings, they're just trash, and they're just feeble-minded. Is it not sickening that such muddle-headed people still wish to enjoy the benefits of status? What have you understood from our exposure of this sort of false leader? As soon as this sort of person becomes a leader or worker, they want to hatch plots regarding the offerings, and their eyes are fixed on the offerings. With a glance, one can tell that they've been hankering for a long time to spend money extravagantly and to squander the offerings. Now, finally, they have their chance. They can spend money arbitrarily in that manner and use God's offering as they wish, enjoying things they didn't work for. Their greedy true colors are thus completely exposed. Do you see such people among the leaders and workers, past and present? They always misinterpret the responsibilities and definition of leaders and workers, and as soon as they become a leader or worker, they take themselves to be the master of God's house. They list themselves among the ranks of priests, and they think themselves a distinguished person. Isn't this a bit feeble-minded? Is it the case that once someone becomes a leader or worker, they're no longer a corrupt human? Is it the case that they immediately turn into a holy person? Once they become a leader, they don't know who they are anymore, and they think they ought to enjoy the offerings. Aren't such people feeble-minded? Such people are definitely feeble-minded. They don't have the reason of normal humanity. Even after we've fellowshipped like this, They still don't know what the duties and responsibilities of leaders and workers are. There certainly are such leaders and workers, and such people's manifestations are quite obvious and prominent. These are basically the manifestations of the various sorts of false leaders regarding the safeguarding of offerings. Those with more serious problems don't fall within the category of false leaders. They're antichrists. So, you need to get a good grasp on this scope. If someone is a false leader, that's what they are. They cannot be characterized as an antichrist. Antichrists are much nastier than false leaders in terms of humanity, actions, manifestations, and essence. Most false leaders have poor caliber. They're feeble-minded. They lack work capability. They're distorted in their comprehension and don't have spiritual understanding. Their character is low. They're selfish and vile, and their hearts are not in the right place. This causes them to not be able to and not do real work with regard to the safeguarding of offerings, and it impacts the reasonable management and appropriate safeguarding of offerings. A portion of offerings even fall into the hands of evil people because of false leaders being derelict in their duties, not doing real work, and not acting in accordance with the principles and requirements of God's house. This kind of problem also comes up quite a bit. The various manifestations of false leaders in the safeguarding of offerings are basically exposed thus. Their character is low. They're selfish and vile. Their comprehension is distorted. They lack work capability. Their caliber is poor. They don't seek the truth principles at all, and they're like dumb and feeble-minded people. Some may say, "We acknowledge all the other manifestations that you exposed, but if they're dumb and feeble-minded, how could they become leaders?" Do you acknowledge that some leaders and workers are dumb and feeble-minded? Do such people exist? Some may say, "You think too little of us. We're all modern people, college or high school graduates. We have excellent powers of discernment with regard to this society and mankind. How could we select a feeble-minded person to be our leader? That couldn't possibly happen." What's impossible about that? Most of you are feeble-minded and of inadequate intelligence too, so it's all too easy for you to select a feeble-minded person to be a leader. Why do I say most of you are feeble-minded? Because most of you, regardless of how much you've experienced, cannot see through to the essence of things and cannot grasp principles. You can persist in just observing regulations for years and years, repeatedly taking the same approach without change, remaining unable to grasp the truth principles no matter how the truth is fellowshipped to you. What's the problem here? Your caliber is too poor. You cannot see through to the essence or root of problems, and are unable to find the patterns of the development of things, much less to follow the principles that should be possessed in doing things. This is called being feeble-minded. How long does it take you all to grasp the principles for things that relate to your duties? There are some people who've been doing text-based work for several years, but even now, the articles and scripts they write are still all hollow words. They still can't get a grasp on the principles, and don't know what reality is, or how to say something real. This is having too poor caliber and too low intelligence. With the intelligence you possess, wouldn't it be all too easy for you to select a feeble-minded person as a leader? And you wouldn't just select them. You would also set your hearts on them. When they were to be dismissed, you wouldn't want that to happen. 2 years later, when you'd seen through them and gained understanding, that's when you'd be able to discern that they're a false leader. But back then, no matter what you were told, you wouldn't let them be dismissed. Aren't you even more feeble-minded than they are? Why do I say that some leaders and workers are of insufficient intelligence? It is because they only know how to do the simplest work. When it comes to slightly more complicated work, they don't know how to do it. When they encounter a little difficulty, they don't know how to handle it. And when they've been given an additional piece of work, they don't know what to do with themselves. Is this not a problem with their intelligence? Are leaders like this not selected by you? And you prostrate yourselves in admiration of them. They believe in God without looking for a romantic partner, and they've expended for God for more than 20 years. They have the will to suffer, all right, and they're really serious about their work. Do they understand the principles in their work, though? If they don't, then who does? And it turns out that their work is a total mess when it's inspected. They're not able to implement any of the work. They are told the principles for their work, but they never know how to do it. They just keep asking questions, and they don't know what to do unless they're told it directly. Telling them the principles is the same as not saying anything. Even if the principles are listed out one by one, they still won't know how to implement the work. Are there leaders like this? No matter how the principles are told to them, they don't understand them, and they aren't able to implement the work. Fellowship with them or instruct them about the same words or thing several times, and still they won't understand, and the problem will go entirely unresolved afterward. They will still ask what to do, and it won't do if a single line is left out. Aren't they feeble-minded? Aren't these feeble-minded leaders selected by you? You can't deny that, can you? There absolutely are such leaders. The various manifestations of false leaders that we've been fellowshipping on today mainly relate to the work of managing offerings. Through our exposure of the various manifestations of false leaders, people should know that managing offerings is an important piece of work for leaders and workers, and that they should not overlook it. Though this piece of general affairs work is different from other work, it's related to the normal operations of the other work of God's house. So, managing offerings is a very important, crucial piece of work. How is it important? The things safeguarded in the work of managing offerings belong to God. To put it somewhat inappropriately, those things are God's personal property. So leaders and workers should all the more so be wholehearted, conscientious, and diligent with regard to this work. If we're looking at this work in terms of its nature, I don't think it's an overstatement to list it under administrative work. The reason why we're listing it under the category of administrative work is that doing this work relates to people's attitude toward God and toward His assets. So, it is necessary for people to have the correct attitude and to grasp the correct principles in doing this work. The reason we're putting it within the category of administrative work is to get leaders and workers to understand that it's very important to do this piece of work, and that this work is a very weighty assignment and a very heavy burden. It's to get them to understand that they shouldn't approach it as if it were regular general affairs work, that they must have accurate, deep knowledge of the importance of this work, and then come to be wholehearted, conscientious, and diligent with regard to it. People can be inattentive toward other people. Even if mistakes occur, it's not a big problem. But I urge people not to be muddled, not to be perfunctory, and not to be all talk and no action in how they approach God. Doing the work of managing offerings well is an important commission for leaders and workers from God.